In the spring of 1512, inside the sprawling Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, a 14-year-old girl named Aisha Sultan was being dressed for marriage. Her groom was Grand Vizier Hademan Pasha, 62 years old, a man who had served 3 sultans, outlived rival factions, and navigated decades of palace intrigue with ruthless intelligence and cruelty so controlled it looked like discipline. All around the imperial harem, the palace moved like a living machine. Servants glided through corridors carrying golden trays. Rare perfumes hung thick in the air, sweet and heavy enough to taste. Musicians tuned their instruments for the ceremony that would begin at dusk. Silk, jewels, lantern light. Everything gleamed with imperial magnificence. But in Aisha's private chamber, far from the glitter and music, there was no celebration. The young princess sat on embroidered cushions, crying without sound, shoulders trembling as she fought to keep it contained. Her mother, Hafsa Sultan, stood over her, voice steady, eyes shining, explaining what would happen once night fell. Once the doors of the bridal chamber closed, and the world stopped pretending this was a blessing. People like to say the body never lies. Aisha's body was already confessing everything her mouth refused to speak. Her hands shook so hard the attendants struggled to apply the traditional henna to her palms. She'd vomited twice that morning, not from sickness, but from sheer panic. The face Venetian ambassadors had once described as radiant when she appeared in public was now pale as marble, shadowed beneath the eyes from sleepless nights. Those nights had started 3 months earlier, the moment her brother, Sultan Selim I, announced the engagement. Aisha did not fear marriage because she was naive. She feared it because she understood. She had heard the sounds that carried through thick palace walls after other royal weddings. She had seen older cousins emerge the next morning, walking slowly, stiffly, eyes empty, and she had seen the stains beneath their silk, evidence the palace treated like a necessary stamp of approval. She'd watched lively, curious girls become quiet shadows in the weeks after their weddings, as if something essential had been taken on that first night, something that never returned. To understand why Ottoman princesses feared their wedding night more than death, you have to understand what marriage meant in the Ottoman Empire. This wasn't romance. It wasn't even what most people imagine when they hear political alliance. It was a ritual of domination carefully designed to establish hierarchy, to break the will of women born into royalty, and to remind the empire that even the daughters of sultans were still transferable property under male control. The system was called dynastic marriage, shaped over centuries by rigid imperial protocol. And here's the cruel twist. Unlike European princesses who were often married to foreign princes of equal rank, Ottoman princesses were legally forbidden to marry royal blood. The logic was brutally practical. A sultan could not risk a brother-in-law with dynastic legitimacy, someone who might gather support, build a rival power base, and become a threat to the throne. So instead, princesses were married exclusively to men of service, viziers, generals, admirals, officials who rose through loyalty to the sultan and whose status depended entirely on imperial favor, that created a contradiction at the heart of the palace. These girls were raised as sacred blood in unmatched luxury, educated in literature, music, calligraphy, treated like near-divine figures in childhood. And then at adolescence, they were handed over to men who were technically their social inferiors. That imbalance produced a warped power dynamic, and it revealed itself most viciously on the wedding night. The protocols for that first night weren't rumors. They were recorded, compiled in the Kanuname, an imperial law code finalized during the reign of Solian the Magnificent. A manuscript preserved in the Topkapi archives, later studied by historians, describes the expected sequence with chilling clarity. It began with splendor. Aisha, would be dressed in layers of silk and brocade so heavy she could barely move without help. Jewels weighing kilograms would hang from her neck and wrists. Her face would be hidden behind multiple veils, not for modesty, but to conceal fear. Any visible reluctance could be read as an insult to the groom. She would be carried in a closed palanquin from the imperial harem to the mansion the Sultan had gifted her husband. Janissary guards, torchbearers, and musicians would surround her. The city would watch a procession that could last for hours, an entire public performance of power and honor. But once the princess crossed the threshold of the bridal mansion, the celebration ended. The guests were dismissed. The witnesses were chosen. They were called the verifying matrons, older women whose duty was to ensure the marriage was consummated, and to confirm the princess was a virgin. Depending on the rank of the bride, there were usually 5 to 7 of them. They did not wait at a respectful distance. Administrative records describe them remaining inside the bridal chamber or directly outside it throughout the night. Their role wasn't symbolic, it was explicit. They were required to listen to confirm what happened. They were expected to judge by sound whether the princess resisted in a way that might be reported as disobedience. And at dawn they were to inspect the sheets for blood. If there wasn't enough protocol allowed escalation, they could enter to confirm and, if necessary, restrain the princess if she resisted. That humiliation wasn't accidental. It was the point, because the wedding night in this system was not about tenderness. It wasn't even primarily about producing heirs. It was about dominance proven in front of witnesses, about demonstrating that the princess's will had been broken, that her body no longer belonged to her, but to her husband, by extension to the empire that arranged the marriage. And the witnesses were only the beginning. Ottoman protocol included a concept known euphemistically as tibil, meaning discipline or education. In reality, it was a mandate. If a princess showed pride, hesitation, or anything that could be interpreted as resistance, her husband was not only permitted but expected to correct it. This expectation is not inferred, it is documented. European ambassadors stationed in Constantinople wrote frequently about screams echoing from bridal mansions during royal weddings. These were not whispered rumors, they were observations recorded in official dispatches sent back to Venice, Genoa, and Vienna. In 1560, Venetian ambassador Girolamo Foscarini reported that neighbors near the mansion of a newly married princess heard such prolonged and violent screaming that several believed a murder was underway and nearly summoned guards. Even more intimate details come from women of the imperial harem, who later gained freedom and spoke openly. One of the most significant accounts belongs to a woman known only as Isabella, an Italian girl captured in her youth and sold into the harem. After decades of service, she was eventually freed and returned to Venice, where she dictated her memoirs in 1593. Her manuscript, later discovered in Venetian archives, devotes several pages to what she witnessed and what she was told about the wedding nights of Ottoman princesses. According to Isabella, especially when the husband was far older than the adolescent bride, what she called rituals of breaking often took place before consummation was allowed. These rituals varied, but the goal was always the same. Princesses were sometimes denied food or water until they demonstrated obedience. Some were forced to remain naked for hours while their husbands stayed fully clothed, an intentional display of vulnerability and control. Others were compelled to perform humiliating acts of service like washing their husband's feet or kneeling in silence, waiting for permission to be touched. And when consummation finally happened, it was rarely gentle. The husbands understood that their role was not to earn affection, it was to assert dominance immediately so there would be no confusion later. Court scholars reinforced this mindset. One legal moral treatise, written in 1623 by Mim Defendi, instructed that when a servant is elevated to the honor of marrying the sultan's blood, he must remember this: though she is a daughter of an emperor in the marriage bed, he is her emperor. If she shows pride in her lineage, he must humble it. If she resists his authority, he must break that resistance. The text emphasized that the first night would define every night that followed. The physical pain endured by these girls was not incidental. It was expected. Palace medical records show that physicians were frequently summoned the morning after royal weddings. They treated severe vaginal tearing, uncontrolled bleeding, and internal injuries that required weeks of recovery. One medical report from 1574 describes a 16-year-old princess examined after her wedding night. The physician noted extensive tearing, bleeding that continued for 12 hours, inability to walk without assistance, and a state of shock marked by trembling and muteness.